Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be reading some creepy backwoods horror stories. I hope you enjoy them. I also want to say before we get into the stories that YouTube has been giving me copyright claims on some of my videos because of the rain sounds at the end. For some reason, the rain sounds are showing up as someone from Hong Kong's song. So, unfortunately, I won't be able to do extra rain at the end. But instead of giving you shorter videos, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the same 2-hour length on these new story videos. But instead of having extra rain sounds at the end, what we'll do is we will do an hour of new stories first, and then an hour of compilation stories at the end. So they'll all be creepy backwoods stories for this video, but the first hour will be new stories and the second hour will be older stories. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that I kind of explained that properly. But anyways, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true scary stories. When I was about 10 or 11, my dad lived in an old farmhouse way out in the country in southern Ohio. I mean, the nearest one-stoplight hamlet was about 10 miles away, and the nearest proper town was about 10 miles from that. It was a late 1800s house on about 30 wooded acres. One day, me and my brother, 4 years older than me, are up in the woods with our dog. My dad's rule was that the dog had to be with us if we were going into the woods. Just tooling around and being rambunctious kids. After a while, we come across what I can only describe as a dilapidated shack, which had to be at least as old as our house. One room with a dirt floor. We went in and found a very old and deteriorated feather mattress laid on the ground, some silverware, and some old kerosene lamps. Being rowdy young boys, we took great pleasure in breaking what was left of the lamps and carving our initials into the wall of the shack. At this point, it's getting to be sundown, so we start back down the little hill to the house, but our dog isn't moving. He's fixated on the tree line behind us, and his hair is raised and his head is low. No matter how we called him, he wouldn't budge and started to growl a low, rumbling growl. Then we heard laughter coming from somewhere in the woods. It sounded like a chuckle at first, then a full-on belly laugh. We then booked it down the hillside after the initial confusion was replaced by fear and adrenaline, as the laughter continued, and the dog charged the other way. I heard a commotion behind me about 30 seconds later, and the dog caught up with us, but wheeled back around and stood his ground again, snarling and barking all the while. This repeated till we made it down the hillside and back into the house. I don't know who or what we encountered in the woods that day, but a few things are certain. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life. Our dog sensed something in there before we did, and he did not like it one bit. And after that incident, he would frequently sit staring at the tree line in our backyard. I've been back to the property since, and it's now overgrown and thoroughly abandoned, which just adds to the creepy and unsettling vibe the place already had. I couldn't bring myself to actually set foot on the property beyond what's left of the driveway the last time I was there, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Again, this property is pretty far out of the way for this to logically have been a drug addict or something like that, and it was far and away not the only incident to occur out there. But in speaking with my brother about it even now, 16 to 17 years later, it still slightly rattles both of us. I was out in the woods the other day with my dog and partner, out in Northern California near this area called Deadwood on the map. We're going to Cherry Lake and decided it was too far, so we ended up going down some random Forest Service roads. We stopped in this clearing where people had camped before just to check it out. Something called us down there. We hear shooting way off in the distance. I'm wandering around the little clearing with my dog, and he starts to point, locked in on the opposite side of the clearing towards the trees. The trees are thick. The feeling in this clearing is thick. I don't see anything. We shush up to listen for more shooting, and then we hear this weird tinkling sound, like crystal glass tinkling off of each other. Kind of like watery twinkling sounds. It's so hard to describe. My dog got in the car. I got behind my car door and grabbed my gun. I shined my laser into the trees and couldn't see anything. The twinkling stopped when my partner racked his gun. We both heard it though. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. I walked to the tree line where the sound was coming from and spoke out into the trees. I said hello a few times and listened. Nothing. My partner goes, "Whatever it was, it's gone." And I could still swear I heard the faintest little twinkling sound. We listened for a few more moments before leaving the area. Was it fairies? Was it aliens? Does anyone have a clue what we heard? Because it was real. None of my hunting friends have any idea. Does anyone out here have any clues? Around this time last year, my family made a trip out to eastern Arizona to rent a cabin and soak in the fall vibes. Surprisingly to some, Arizona has some pretty dazzling leaf peeping if you know where to look. We set out for a hike along the Black River to get some fresh air. Lots of fresh air. It was super windy that day, and I didn't think to bring a coat, so I wrapped myself up in my niece's blankie. She was 4 and the other child was 2, so the hike only lasted for about 2 hours, 1 in and 1 out. On the way out, I started to feel like someone was running up behind me and leering over my shoulder. At some points, I thought I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, but every time I turned to look, the others were too far behind. My sister caught up to me at one point, and she could tell that I was a little rattled. Since we had the kids with us and still a bit of a walk to get back, I was trying not to raise the alarm. But I've had this sense since we were kids, so she knows the look I get when I feel something that she can't. After a little prodding, I told her what I'd been feeling. As I spoke, we suddenly heard the shrill crescendo of chimes being struck by the wind. My sister jumped and clung to my arms as we spotted the chimes in a nearby tree. They were colorful bar chimes that to me appeared to be shaped like feathers. They were unlike any chimes I'd ever seen before, and I definitely didn't see them when I hiked through that same spot on the way in. Considering how windy it was that day, we definitely would have heard them. Back in 2010, I was driving around looking for a place to bird hunt. I finally stopped at a piece of town-owned property that I had only gone on once before, and that was to fish for trout in a brook that crossed about a mile in. After parking, I started down an old tote road that split the property for its entire length. The day was very nice, and nothing seemed unusual. I followed the road until I got to the far side of an old wood yard that abutted the stream. That's when it just got quiet. The opening was probably 20 yards across, with the brook hidden behind some alders on the other side. I sensed it before I heard it. Something told me to not go across the clearing to the stream. I've spent a lifetime in the woods, and I've only had that feeling a few times. The first sound that I heard were heavy footsteps, very deliberate and slow. I couldn't see what was making the sound, and for no reason I felt fear. I knew that I did not want to see what was approaching me. It stopped at the brook, and I heard it cross and walk to the edge of the alders and then stop. All that I had was a single 20-gauge shotgun with birdshot. I had a feeling of danger. It moved on the inside of the alders to my left a few yards at the time. The only glimpse that I caught was a dark, narrow figure, very tall, as in at least 7 feet. Not knowing what to do, I pointed my shotgun in the air and touched off a shot. It just stayed where it was. I shouted. It did not move. That little voice told me to go. Don't run, but go. As I backed up, the alders where I last heard it moved and parted as if it was getting a better look. But whatever it was stayed right there, as if to let me know that it saw me and to go no further. That mile walk back to my truck felt as if I was walking through a cemetery at night, always turning around and looking everywhere. This encounter has played over and over in my mind. I don't know what that was. I've never gone back, only because something inside of me is saying that it would not end well. 14 years later, and it still scares me. Anyway, that's my encounter, and I've never told anyone until now. Long-time lurker, first-time poster. I haven't been able to stop thinking about this incident and wanted to see if it resonates with anyone else. Me, a 28-year-old male, my wife, a 28-year-old female, and dog, a 3-year-old male, recently went to Red River Gorge, a state park in SE, Kentucky. We're no strangers to camping in the park, having been there at least 20 times over the past 8 years. We chose a spot I've been to 2 or 3 times before. It's worth noting that this site is outside of other dispersed camping areas and is essentially the only proper spot with car parking along a 2-mile stretch of road. There's a dilapidated barn about a mile up from where we drove in, and a cemetery about 1/3 of a mile in the opposite direction. Otherwise, it's a rarely traveled road, and we saw no one all day, just an occasional car, maybe 1 or 2 an hour. The spot is at the base of a 30-foot incline that a 4x4 could handle. Our SUV was parked horizontally at the top, blocking other vehicles from descending. From there, it's about 30 yards into the campground, with another slope leading to the river's edge and swimming hole. The day went great. We spent time near the beach, letting our dog swim, then did typical camping activities like hiking, foraging, chopping wood, throwing the hatchet, and enjoying a few beers. Once sunlight began to fade around 6:30, we started the fire and began cooking dinner. As darkness fell and the last light disappeared, we heard the usual sounds: squirrels rustling, things falling into the leaves, which spooked my wife a bit, but we didn't think much of it. Then, at about 9 p.m., sitting around the healthy fire and listening to music, we heard heavy shuffling in the leaves, definitely something large or heavy. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the road, about halfway between us and our car. I stopped the music, and after about 10 seconds of dead silence, we heard the shuffling again. Before I could call out, we heard this strange and unnatural noise, something like a throttling, ascending pitch mixed with a shriek. Neither of us can verbally describe it, and I can confidently say I've never heard anything like it before. It was about 20 to 25 feet away, just outside the reach of my headlamp. Our dog went insane, hair standing on end, barking incessantly into the darkness. He was on a long lead, or I'm sure he would have taken off after it. My wife and I were frozen. I was holding my hatchet and trying to catch any movement or sound to track. After about 2 to 3 minutes of that, with no further noises, I calmed the dog, and we grabbed some essentials and hurried to the car. Our adrenaline was pumping as we discussed coyotes, foxes, or other animals as the possible culprits. I didn't want to mention the possibility of people, as that would have heightened the paranoia. We eventually passed out after about an hour, but I spent the rest of the night in and out of shallow sleep, feeling very uncomfortable both mentally and physically. I've always struggled to sleep anyway, except fully horizontal. At around 3 a.m., right next to my head, I heard a singular knock on my window, like someone tapped the glass with one knuckle. My wife didn't wake up, and I scanned the outside of the car but didn't see or hear anything. I struggled to doze off again, and my heartbeat was rapid. When we finally got the first light around 7 a.m., we cooked breakfast, packed up our campsite, and got out of Dodge. No prints or anything out of sorts with our remaining belongings either. What's strange to me is that after hearing the noise, we heard no additional heavy shuffling from the source. With our dog barking so aggressively, we should have heard whatever it was moving away. We've looked up various animal noises native to the gorge, and nothing even remotely resembles what we heard. The knock on the window was also isolated. There were no other noises or visible happenings outside the car immediately following. Lastly, I had a thought the day after we left. I remember whistling for our dog after dark, since we had some scraps to give him near the fire. Immediately I thought, crap, I shouldn't have whistled. But up until this trip, I've never been a believer of those superstitions. I just like to respect the folklore I've heard. In hindsight, we're now convinced I may have invited a Wendigo or skinwalker to our camp. I won't take those superstitions lightly again, and I'm sure this occurrence will affect at least my next few overnights in those woods. Hello. To start this story, I want to say that I have not seen anything like this in my life. At the time, I was 15 years old pet-sitting a friend of mine's dog while they were out of town, and in Benson, Arizona is where this took place. This property had a lot of acres, and it took about 15 minutes to get their little house right in the middle of the probably about 75 acres. At the time, it was about, I want to say 10 p.m. My friend had 8 dogs, and they usually stayed outside for the most part, because they're big watchdogs who seem to have been able to defend themselves in the past. Before everything happened, I was inside their tiny home, making food, when I heard her biggest dog start squealing kind of quietly, very scared and in pain, but loud enough for me to hear. I knew the sounds were unusual this dog was making. I shot up and ran outside to see what was going on. I thought maybe the dog might have hurt himself or something similar, but this was not the case, and I ended up seeing a 5 to 6 foot tall, pale, very skinny creature hunched over this dog, sucking on his head. I was very stunned, almost too stunned to speak, but I managed to shake that feeling off. I start yelling at this thing because the dog started yelping loud, and I'm telling the creature to get out of here and trying to scare it, and I run over to her dog as fast as I could, because I've heard these things before, perhaps a chupacabra, and I know they would likely eat the dog if I didn't do something. But I stop about 10 feet in front of it to see this creature jump up and run as fast as it can away. I couldn't help but keep looking over my shoulder the rest of the time I was there. I also didn't let those dogs out at night, and I didn't care to go out there either. So when my friends came back, I told everything what happened and what I saw. It felt like everyone was just as frightened as I was, and it made me even more unsettled. I ended up leaving that desert and did not look back. I still don't know what to make about it to this day, except that I know that it was something scary. So the other night on a mountain trail I've gone to for years to watch the sunset, I felt like some guy was tracking me back to my car. First time in my entire life of hiking alone, and I've done some sketchy stuff alone at dusk, that I felt uneasy. So the mountain trail I go to is huge, with many different side trails on it, but there is one main trail that goes straight up and down the center of the mountain, which is usually pretty quick to get up to watch the sunset. I've done it hundreds of times at this point in my life for years now. Have watched the sunset and walked back to my car in pitch black many times. Never felt uneasy the way that I did that night. I get to the peak, walk back down to a little bit to my usual viewing spot of the sunset, and suddenly some guy who is also alone comes out of one of the side trails. I think nothing of it, exchange a few words from a distance. Guy gets on his way, and I can see him even as a small dot as he goes down to the bottom of the trail. But I'm thinking, well, there's only one way out of here and he knows I'm still up here. So I knew that I wasn't sticking around for it to get dark. The minute the sun goes behind the mountain, I start my way back down. As you get closer to the bottom of the trail, there's a section that narrows and is nothing but woods and trees on each side, before it opens up again to a huge open dirt trail, and then the parking lot. My head's on a swivel the entire way back down. I get to the creepy dark narrow part just before the open trail to the parking lot, and I hear someone make a noise. Like a weird noise that someone would just make to themselves, but loud enough as if they wanted me to hear. But I see no one and keep going. I get about halfway on the open dirt road, almost to the parking lot, and turn around, and someone is decently far behind me out of nowhere. I don't look back again. I pick up the pace, get to my car, and book it. There was only one truck left in the parking lot by the time I got back, and it was on, and someone was definitely in the driver's seat. Call me paranoid, but again, I have never felt uneasy or like someone was following me like that in my entire life. And I've done about 80% of my hiking completely alone, and a lot at night. Like deep woods type of stuff at sunset and dusk. And never been almost scared like that before. I was homeless for a few years from the ages of 18 to 21, and I used to stay in a tent with my ex. I always had to end up moving my tent spot eventually because the cops would find us. Either way, I had spent a lot of time in the woods at night. One night when walking back to my tent, I heard something down the trail a bit. I shined my light in the direction of the sound to be met with glowing eyes reflecting my flashlight. However, where the eyes were made it so whatever I was looking at was taller than me, and I'm 5'8". There is no animal that tall in my area. I turn to my ex and tell him to start going to the tent faster. He could tell something was off, so he asked if I was all right. I told him that I'll tell him when we get back to the tent, because I've always been told to not acknowledge such creatures and spirits, as it gives them more power. Then some nights there would be smacking on our tent. It would hit all the sides of the tent. We would look out the tent windows and check outside the tent, but we would never find anything or hear any footsteps. Another night during the summer, we had decided to go for a small hike at night because it was way more of a tolerable temperature. About 15 minutes into the hike, I had started to feel paranoid, like I was being watched. About 5 minutes later, I heard a maniacal laugh coming from somewhere in the woods. I couldn't pinpoint which direction though. My ex asked what that was, and I loudly said, I don't know, but whatever the heck it is, it needs to stop. As soon as I said this, multiple maniacal laughs now started. My ex and I turned around and walked back for what felt like the longest 20 minutes. Another time, I found a severed coyote head with something hung in the tree behind it that had a tooth in it. And lastly, one time I was with my friend, parked on the road into the woods, so we could smoke. The passenger window was down, which is where I was sitting. The woods were right next to me. Again, the feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. 2 minutes or so later, I hear a hello, and then John coming from the woods. I tell my friend to turn around and we need to leave. I didn't tell her why. because like I said, I don't like to acknowledge these things until I'm far away from them. That's all that immediately comes to mind at the moment. Thank you for reading. I was talking with my stepmom about late-night driving experiences, and she told me about an encounter she had in Leroy, Montana, on a road trip from Washington to North Dakota. She was on Route 87, and she was running low on gas. The Fort Benton exit had a lot of construction going on, and she couldn't see any way to get to the gas stations from the exit ramp, so she got back on the highway. After a while, she saw an exit sign for Leroy, Montana, and it said there was gas and food available. She took the exit and saw another sign reading Leroy 5 miles. At this point, they had no service and were relying solely on an atlas. The road took them through a dark wooded forest, and after a while, my stepmom realized the odometer had gone up 15 miles, and they still hadn't found any sign of a town. But she kept driving and waited for a friend, who was holding the atlas, to say something. After a few more minutes, her friend spoke up and said she thinks they passed Leroy somehow, and my stepmom agreed. They found a fat shoulder to turn around on, and as they were pulling off to make their turnaround, they both had an image flash into their heads. A man standing in the middle of the road. Neither of them actually saw him in real life, but both could describe the man in exact detail. He was tall with a brown flannel and what looked to be a scythe broken in half, with the handle wrapped around in a white bloody cloth. He also had a thick scar across his forearm. While that by itself is weird enough that my stepmom planned to never go anywhere near that place again, for the next 8 months she received frequent phone calls from Leroy, Montana. After my own research, I've come to find out that Leroy is a ghost town, unmarked on Google Maps unless you specifically search it up. Me and some friends have already planned to go to Leroy over spring break this year, and see if we can't find anything. I'm posting this here to see if anybody else might have seen or heard anything similar in the area, or any insight as to what might have happened. So I live in the southeastern corner of South Dakota. There isn't a lot of wooded areas down here, but there is some. My boyfriend and I have been spending lots of time exploring the few wooded areas that we have. Yesterday afternoon, we went to this one area. We would not have expected anything to happen, because it was still decently close to the town of Brandon. If anything, our concern would have been people. This park/wooded area has lots of things to explore for the area, and we brought one of his friends with us. We are more intense with our hikes than he is, so he let us leave him behind and we went exploring off the beaten trail and did our own thing. By the time we were getting back to the area, we left him the sun was starting to set, and he wasn't there. So we called him up and he said he was headed back to the car. It's important to note that during this time, we were making these screams back and forth at each other, trying to see if we could hear each other beyond the phone. Boyfriend and I had one more trail we wanted to explore, so we headed down that trail, and then eventually it was actually getting dark, so we made it back to the trail that took us back to the car. We were walking through the woods and joking about how friend was probably going to try and scare us or something like that. We saw a deer and didn't think anything of it, but it slightly startled myself originally. Finally, we made it to this area. That is where the woods start to turn to prairie, and we heard this scream, and a really fast deer jumped through this tree that was split into 2 branches. I don't know a good way to explain that tree layout. We, being logical, started calling out to his friend being like, "Hey, you got us, not funny." But it clearly wasn't our friend. We're a little on edge after that, but just picking up our pace, getting to the car. Him and I took turns kind of looking back behind us, and I saw what looked like an obese man just kind of standing on the trail behind us, but it had more of a ghost-like presence to it than an actual man. Boyfriend looked back at some point and said, "Hey, I don't want to scare you, but like, it almost looks like there is a person back there or something. My face just dropped and I said word for word, you saw it too. And then we just kind of looked at each other and ran. We ended up taking the wrong path, so we had to run a lot longer. We eventually made it back to the car. His friend was there, and he swears on his life that he wasn't messing with us. Either way, there was no way this dude could have really ran that fast, or looked like what we saw behind us. When we got home, we started trying to look stuff up. We think it could be a skinwalker, but also this is South Dakota. We're on Lakota Sioux land, not Navajo land. Either way, it was a very creepy experience. Late April of 2022, me and a few friends went on a road trip through southern Illinois. We passed by Shawnee National Forest and stopped at the Trigg Observation Tower. After soaking in the beautiful view and smoking a few joints with a random stoner couple we met on the way up, we parted ways with our smoke buddies and headed out towards our campsite for the night. It was getting late, and we were driving down these back roads as the sun was setting. It was pretty isolated. Incredibly thick woods flanked both sides of the road, and not another car in sight. That's when we saw a light up ahead, just barely visible through some thick brush. We slowed down, thinking it was some campers getting set up for the night, or some hikers who had lost before sundown. As we approached, something seemed off. The light emanated from this old camper van, and the thing hadn't moved in months. Vines were slowly creeping over the canopy. The whole setup just screamed abandoned. We looked back to have a second look, trying to make out whether it was from a fire or something inside the van. At first glance, we didn't see anyone as we surveyed the area. But there he was, feet away from the camper, half hiding behind a tree. He was shirtless, only in his coverall pants and hiking boots. He was just staring at us, and didn't reply when we shouted a hello. As he began to walk in our direction with one hand hidden behind his back, as if he were holding something, we called out again to see if he needed assistance or knew where the campsite was. But he just kept coming, silent and expressionless. We didn't wait to see what he was up to. We leaped right back into the car and flew out of there, dust and rocks kicking up as we took off down the road. We were pretty shaken up by the time we had finally pulled into our campsite. Worse was yet to come. We had left the firewood at the last gas station, and with the rain, everything around us was pretty wet. We ended up hanging up our hammocks and attempted to fall asleep without a fire, which wasn't great for our nerves either. No sooner had we all sighed and started to relax than we heard footsteps coming up from over the crest of a hill. Slow and deliberate, just like the guy we'd seen earlier. We killed our lights and sat there in the dark listening. It felt like eons before the steps stopped, and we finally worked up the courage to look around. We took our flashlights and knives, just in case, and did a quick scan but saw nothing. By then we said screw it, so we started packing up our gear, figuring we'd just sleep in the car. Then, from behind us there was a cough, and that was all we needed to pack up in a hurry and race down the cluttered trail to our car. We didn't even worry about packing neatly. We just tossed all of our stuff in the back and got out of there. The next hour was a blur of the dark. Twisty little roads with no cell service, and not a hint of where we were going. Finally, we hit a paved road, and after about 20 more minutes and running on fumes, we came upon a little country store with a gas pump connected to an adorable house and auto garage. It had already closed for the night, but the family living there saw us at the pump while they were having dinner and came outside to help. They even opened the store so we could buy some snacks and pop. After what we experienced, talking to them was really a huge relief and let us calm our nerves. We eventually got back on the road and kept driving. 6 hours, straight back to home. In high school, during a quiet summer night, me and two friends went to investigate a local ghost road. It was rumored to have a ghost lady who would appear, carrying a couple of bags and then dematerialize in front of you. The road has fields, woods, and houses, spread out, but by no means did it feel remote or creepy during the day. We pulled the little truck to the side of the road, turned the engine off, and just sat quietly with the windows down. The cool night air felt perfect. We were still talking like normal about life and girlfriends and really just half paying attention to the dark road that stretches out away from us. Then I saw something. Here's what I saw. During a lulling conversation, I looked up to see the silhouette of a 3 to 4 foot tall humanoid shadow walking down the opposite side of the street no more than 40 feet away. I didn't say anything but stared in disbelief. It looked like half a Muppet had been walking. No sooner than I saw this thing, it walked through a darker shadow cast by a nearby tree in the moonlight, and emerged out the other end of the shadow, looking like a normal house cat. It was no longer upright, but was distinctly a cat. It walked a few more steps and looked at us, and silently bounded over the guardrail and into the woods directly opposite us. From the small, weird 2-foot walker to the cat over by the guardrail, probably only took more than 5 seconds in total. I said nothing the entire time. Strangely, nobody did. Then the driver said to nobody in particular, "Oh, it's just a cat." I said to him, "Why the confusion? What did you see?" And he said, "I thought it was a small person at first, but it was just a cat." I said, "Wait, I saw the small person too." We just looked at each other up the queue and headed home. This was almost 30 years ago now. The area has gotten substantially more built up, with new homes and such. I think about this from time to time. I wonder if it was my eyes just playing tricks on me. But it is noteworthy that someone else in the vehicle saw the same thing at the same time. My fiance and I went for a 3-day trip to Gatlinburg, and we spent our days in the mountains, hiking and spending time in and around the national park. Tonight, at around midnight, trying to get all the time in the mountains that we can, we decided to take an hour drive from our hotel room up the mountain to an overview/lookout type of spot on top of a said mountain to see if we can catch an awesome look at the stars, because there's a lot of lights in Gatlinburg at night. Driving up, neither of us noticed literally anything off, other than that the mountain winds were a little spooky at night. We're from Florida, so it's just unfamiliar. But as soon as we get to where we were going, and she and I got out of my car, I'm almost overwhelmed with a vile, oppressive feeling outside with me. But not wanting to make the lady uncomfortable, I don't react too much just yet. The wind is absolutely roaring, and unfortunately we couldn't see any stars due to cloud cover. So I tell her I'm going to step to the side and pee, and we can get back to the hotel room. As soon as I get like 10 feet away, I get a very strange feeling of extreme vulnerability and detachment from everything around me. Almost as though I'm miles away from the nearest person, though obviously I'm only feet away from my fiancé. I turned around to walk back to the car and heard something off to my right, and instinctively look over to see something roughly human size go down to coyote size and kind of just hop over a rail from about 200, maybe more feet away. I quickly get back to the car and usher my fiancée in, still not trying to scare her or at least show her that I'm scared, but she asked if I was all right, and my reaction was a dead giveaway. We jumped in and sped off. Never in my life have I had an experience like this before, and never in my life have I really had a reason to be made uncomfortable of just being outside. But I truly believe that something was with us in those woods that night. Hey everyone, I've been lurking here for a while and thought I'd share a strange experience from about 7 years ago that's been haunting me ever since. I've been a trucker for over a decade, and you hear all sorts of stories on the road, but this one still gives me chills. I was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway in the Midwest when I decided to pull over at a truck stop for the night. The place was pretty run down, and there were only a few other trucks parked there. As I was getting ready to settle in, I overheard a couple of guys talking near one of the trucks. They seemed on edge, whispering urgently. I caught snippets of their conversation and heard one of them say, "Watch out for the lizards." I thought it was a weird thing to say, but didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was some local slang or inside joke. As the night wore on, I started to drift off, but then I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. It was strange because it didn't sound like just one person. It was like a small group was walking around, but the pattern was irregular and unsettling. Curiosity got the better of me, so I peeked out of my window. I couldn't see much in the dim light, but there were definitely figures moving around the parking area. They seemed to be skulking between the trucks, almost like they were looking for something. I told myself it was probably just other drivers stretching their legs, but the unease wouldn't go away. Suddenly, I heard a sharp knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. I called out asking who it was, but there was no response, just the sound of footsteps shuffling away. At this point, I was too spooked to investigate further, so I locked my doors and tried to get some sleep. Just as I was drifting off again, I heard a low hissing sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was faint but persistent, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I squeezed my eyes shut and told myself it was my imagination. But then I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. Throughout the night, I could hear knocks and scratches on the other trucks around me. Every once in a while, there was some sort of yelling or moaning coming from the distance, like someone, or something, was trying to communicate or call out. Occasionally, a smoky smell, like a cigarette, would waft through the air when these creatures were close to my truck. The rest of the night was a blur of eerie sounds and creeping dread. I kept telling myself it was just some weird local prank, but the whole thing felt off. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I didn't waste a second. I fired up my truck and got out of there without even looking back. I didn't want to see what might have been left in the morning. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was something more to those lizards than meets the eye. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination, or maybe there's something out there in those backwoods truck stops that we're better off not knowing about. Stay safe out there, and keep your eyes and ears open. You never know what might be lurking in the dark. In 2017, I was working at a summer camp near Hancock, New York. One day I went out with my boss to go buy supplies. I took the opportunity for a drive out of the camp. Everything was normal. I didn't experience anything except for this one trip. We're driving back to our car at the night, and suddenly, this huge, I'm guessing animal, ran out in front of us and stopped in front of the road in front of our car. Luckily, she wasn't driving very fast, so we could stop in time. When I looked, there was this weird creature that was higher than her bonnet. The only thing it resembled slightly was a skunk, but way too big for a skunk. I'm from the UK, and I'm not sure what her car was, but it was about the size of a Vauxhall Corsa, for size comparison. Thing is, my boss was pretty straight to the point, never scared of anything. That's one reason I loved her. However, she would not discuss what this thing was. If I asked her about it, she would either snap it was nothing or change the subject. I'm just wondering if anyone knows any legends or anything from this area. It was between Hancock and Friendwoods, New York. So my boyfriend and I live in a small neighborhood. Our house faces a densely wooded riverfront. Our street isn't very busy. It's dark and there isn't a park in the woods, so not many people go down there, much less in the middle of the night. Last night, around midnight, my boyfriend was sitting on our porch smoking a cigarette when he heard a weird voice in the distance. It was clearly speaking a different language, and the only way he could describe it was, it sounded like Mickey Mouse. He thought it was just kids screwing around, but as he listened closely, he noticed it was just one voice talking and laughing. It wasn't talking to anyone except itself, whatever or whoever it was. It was far enough in the distance that my boyfriend felt comfortable listening, until it started to whistle an eerie song that he couldn't place, and as it whistled, it began to go closer. He ran inside and locked all the doors and windows. He tried waking me up, but I get up at 5 a.m. every morning for work and I sleep like a rock. Hearing about it when I woke up to get a drink of water really heaved my jeebies. My first thought was some crackhead tweaking out in the woods perhaps, but of course my brain immediately goes to cryptids. I can't help it. What do you think? I've been combing the internet for hours this morning trying to find out legends and myths about this. Please give me some ideas. It was a random day. My family and I had a trip planned out to go somewhere far from home, just to go to a place in the Philippines called Dahil Ayan Bukidnon Park. While on the way, we used a GPS tracker to reach our destination. None of us were aware that the GPS may not be accurate. We followed the route. My uncle was driving the car. It was a fortune car, big enough to fit many people inside. As we got somewhere, it was still sunset, and we were going up a hill surrounded by tall trees. I fell asleep for a while because I was already exhausted from all the journey we went through. But I soon woke up from my mother's voice saying, Dongpag Bante, Kema Hulog Ta. It's in Cebuano. It meant, be careful, we're gonna fall off. I looked around the car window. We were on top of a hill, the sides of the road being so thin and tight. One wrong turn and we would all come crashing down. My cousins and I were at the back of the car. We stayed quiet because we knew not to panic at situations like these, but my mom was the only one panicking. As we went further, my uncle drove slowly, and thankfully we didn't fall off, and managed to find an area that we could make a U-turn. It was still on the hill, but the area was wide enough. After making it back to the main road safely, we were all shaken, scared. Time skip of hours driving. After that, it was already night. Nothing at sight, no lights, and it was nothingness. My family didn't follow the GPS this time. They used their memories because they used to be on that road before. We were going uphill again. I had no idea where it was, but all I saw was trees around the car, and the quiet sound of the car wheels driving over the gravel. Then, at some point we stopped. I was confused, but it appeared that there was no continuation of the road ahead. Everyone in the car was quiet. My mother asked my uncle to check outside. When they opened the car door, it was so cold. The wind was strong and I heard the trees. It was spooky and sent a chill in my spine. My uncle closed the door as he turned on the front lights of the car. There was a line of people, many of them. I don't have any idea what they were doing alone in the woods. It was so weird. After that, I fell asleep from exhaustion. I didn't eat all day because we were stranded in the woods. The next thing, I woke up and we were already in the main road and stopped by a 7-Eleven shop, and they bought hot dogs for my cousins and I to eat. All of us were starving and had no energy. This was the most experience that I almost died. I'm glad my family and I were safe. Just a reminder, if you want to go somewhere, you can't always trust the GPS or the maps because the routes are outdated. I grew up in the Midwest, just a little north of Chicago. When I was probably around 12, a friend and I saw some deer behind his house. There was a large field behind it that a forest bordered, so it wasn't uncommon for deer to be there. Being kids, we wanted to go pet the deer, so we slowly approached them. We walked across the field to them so they wouldn't spook them. Looking back, the deer should have ran. Two big creatures walking towards a herd of deer should have spooked them, but they all just kept on eating the grass. I was in the front of my friend, so I got a closer look at the deer than he did. I was maybe about 6 feet away from this deer when it finally looked up at me. I noticed her knees and saw that they were bloodied. I just figured it was because she had previously laid down on them and something got them scratched up. I looked up at her face and I was filled with fear, something that was very unlike me as a child, and so we ran. Now, remembering this later, something I did not think about at the time as strange was the fact that her knees were facing the wrong way. Not like they were broken, but like they had grown to be the wrong way. Of course, she could have a defect or something like that. But everything combined with the feeling of dread I felt looking into her eyes creeps me out years later. If anyone has any thoughts on this, please share. So, for some background info, me and a couple of my buddies went fishing. We hit a couple of spots that we hadn't been to before, and we didn't catch anything. So we went out to our typical spot, and it's basically in the middle of nowhere. It's a small creek that connects to the Kentucky River, and we are out there for about an hour. Nothing weird going on and no sense of fear. Then suddenly we hear this screeching noise. And no, not like someone yelling in the distance. Imagine a giant mosquito. And I thought there was just a bug near me. But then my buddy sitting in the car 40 feet away also heard it. So whatever it was loud enough to cover that sort of distance. A few seconds later, a weird, almost banging noise like something big and metal falling. And for instance, we are in the middle of absolutely nowhere. So I'm just super tripped out. We instantly realized we needed to leave. I've been trying to find a story that relates to this, but no one seems to have heard a noise like that I could find. This was around 12 at night. If anyone has any idea of what this could have been, please let me know. This happened some months ago, precisely on the 5th of November. I live in northern Italy, so that was the evening in which the red aurora borealis appeared visible for us. I was chilling at home after a long day when one of my friends calls me and asked me if I wanted to try to go see the aurora with him. I said sure, because I'm always up for an adventure. And from where I live in the top mountain is circa 1 hour in the car. At 21:30-ish, he comes and gets me and up we go. We even see a cute chunky fox while ascending. We arrive at the top of the mountain. There's a big parking lot there, and we get out of the car. Pretty freezing winds and howling winds. We encountered only one car on the road, and one is parked at a distance from us, apparently empty or just dark. We take some pictures. Can't really see the aurora, but some reddish specks of light here and there. Still magical. We can, however, see a beautiful Milky Way. So despite the cold, we just stand there in admiration of the universe above us, chatting lightly. After 40 minutes to an hour, I start to feel uneasy. Not really with a reason. Then my friend goes to use the restroom. He only goes a short distance and remains in sight, and I concentrate on the surroundings, as I'm used to giving credit to my internal voice. So I suddenly start picking up on something. I hear footsteps. Every time the wind goes down, they go silent, but a bit delayed. I can clearly distinguish them as the iced snow crunched under the weight. When the wind picks up in strength, I tell my friend when he comes back. We listen, and he confirms it as they're getting progressively closer. We made eye contact, decided we saw enough of the stars and didn't want to stay around to find out, and calmly walked back to the car, locked the doors, and booked it swiftly out of there. We kept check the next day about robberies or anything else, but we didn't hear anything. I'm still amazed and spooked in how sudden. I wanted to write about what happened to me and my partner in September of 2023. We were hanging out with our two new friends, a husband and wife. Let's say their names are John and Mary. They decided to camp at Todd Lake Recreation Center, which is in George Washington National Forest, and invited us to spend time at their campsite, have a few beers, relax by the campfire, etc. My partner and I decided that we weren't up for overnight camping, but were down to hang out for a bit. The recreation center was only 45 minutes from home, so we thought we could drive if we didn't have but a few drinks, ate food, and chilled for a couple of hours. So we get there at around 4:30 p.m. and have camp snacks, sandwiches, chips, nothing special, and some alcoholic seltzers. We wander down to the lake and let their dog swim, and then we decide to head back to the campsite and start a fire. I knew we weren't staying the night, so I kept track of how many drinks I had and the food I ate to ensure that I was suitable for the drive later. In total, I had 5 seltzers the entire night, over hours. Not to sound like an alcoholic or anything, but 5 seltzers do not explain what happened to us that night. I can handle my alcohol, and I'm responsible while drinking by pacing myself, eating food and drinking water in between each beverage. So we're hanging by the fire with John and Mary, and next thing you know, John says, "Hey, do you guys want to walk down to the lake?" And we respond, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." The camp has a short walking path to the lake, probably half a mile away. It should only take minutes to get there. Now this is when it gets weird. I look at my cell phone and see that it's 8:30 p.m. and decide to put my phone in the car before we walk down to the lake because I don't want to lose it. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the woods, passed out on the ground on a trail with my partner in the middle of George Washington National Forest, an hour away from their campsite, and John and Mary were nowhere to be found. My partner was on his back with his head turned to the side, and I was lying halfway on the moss and the other half on him, with my head turned to the side, almost as if we were placed perfectly. We were lost and both felt extremely confused and sick. We both started throwing up and had to take breaks walking out to try and find John and Mary's campsite. It took us an hour to get back, and it appeared we had hiked an hour outside of the recreation center. We both had zero recollection of how we got there, why we were both passed out in the middle of the woods at night, and why the heck 5 seltzers with food over a multiple hour span made either one of us be so sick and lose memory at the same time. My partner was completely disoriented and started screaming for help. I was begging him to be quiet because I felt so sick and had no idea where we were. I needed a moment to collect myself and get my bearings to try and hike out of our current situation. Something to know about us is that we are both avid hikers and backpackers and very comfortable outdoors in nature, even alone. However, at that moment, I was so thankful that I didn't wake up in the woods at night on a trail alone. Thankfully, he was with me. The entire time, we both felt like we were being watched as we tried to find our way back. It was unsettling. I was telling my partner when we were trying to find our way back to the campsite that something felt very wrong, and when we got back, we needed to get in the car and leave. I felt it in my bones, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what happened. We were both utterly shocked that we somehow both conveniently blacked out simultaneously. I know what you're thinking. We were drugged, right? We felt that too. But why would John and Mary, our supposed friends, drug us? And why would they drug us and carry us deep into the forest? It didn't add up. We finally made it back to the campsite, and I first opened my car and grabbed my phone to see what time it was. It was 2:30 a.m. My heart sank. How did this happen? How did it go from 8:30 p.m. when we were walking down to the lake, which was half a mile or less from their campsite, to 2:30 in the morning? Neither of us liked not knowing what happened to us in that lost time. So before we decided to leave, my partner knocked on their tent and said, "Hey John, we're leaving. What happened, man? We need to get out of here. Something's off." John then replies, "Where is Mary?" And my partner and I both looked at each other concerned and say to John, "What do you mean? She's not in the tent with you?" And John replies, "No, I thought she was with you two." That's when we all decided to search for Mary. John said the last thing he remembered was we were hanging out by the fire and asked if we wanted to go down to the lake. And then, hours later, he woke up underneath the picnic table at the campsite, not remembering how he got there. However, something seemed fishy, and he was far too relaxed. We found Mary down the trail to the lake, slumped over, asleep in the woods near the campsite. Neither remembered what happened and why we all ended up in these places. No one can remember what happened for those few hours. It was misty, dark, and foggy on the mountain, and I was shivering, with my teeth chattering, feeling sick and just ready to go home. We got in the car and returned to our house, but it took a while to settle enough to sleep. When we spoke to John the next morning, they laughed it off and said, "Maybe we just shouldn't drink so much next time we hang out." I remember all of us hanging by the fire, and then mentioning us going down to the lake, but I stayed back to deal with the dog and you three went down there. John changed his story from what he had said the night before. Something didn't set right with me. The Todd Lake Recreation Center was almost empty. We only saw one other family camping that night, and they weren't anywhere near our campsite, which was also odd. My partner and I don't feel like we drank enough to the point that it would cause us to black out, especially at the same time. So what did happen? We were so sore and a little cut up, but our only thoughts were this must have been something paranormal, or they did drug us. I started to get flashbacks of memory, and all I remember was John's face on the beach, then black. Did aliens abduct us? Was it something from Appalachian folklore like Mothman or some other bizarre creature? Did we all drink too much? Did we get drugged? My partner lost his phone that night, so I called the ranger the following Monday, and they said they found it in the woods busted up between campsites 5 and 6. But John and Mary were camping at campsite 1. The ranger mailed it back to us because I didn't want to drive back there and had a horrible pit in my stomach. The phone never cut back on, even though the front of the screen was perfectly intact. It was only the back of the phone that had been busted. A part of me doesn't want to know what's on that iPhone. The next day, my partner was violently ill, and I was shivering with teeth chattering and chill bumps all day. We honestly probably should have gone to the hospital. In my 30 years, I've never experienced anything like this. And to this day, we are skeptical about meeting new friends or having new people into our lives. Either way, we are both so grateful that we made it home safely that night, and we have each other. What do you all think? My partner doesn't have social media, but I blocked John and Mary on mine, and we haven't seen them since. We moved to another state in 2024, not because of this reason, but I've dealt with a lot of PTSD and night terrors since this occurred. I now worry if it was John or both of them. Are they doing this to other people? Thank you for reading. So, this isn't something I witnessed. I was told this story by one of the men who allegedly saw it. For context, this guy had run with some questionable crowds and did what jobs he had to make money at times, if you get my drift. So, he has a lot of stories. I mostly consider this a tall tale, but there is still enough of it that makes me wonder what if. According to him, we'll call him Zed for the sake of the story. He had been finishing up some work down in Louisiana back in the late 1990s with his buddy and had a few days to kill, namely to get some fishing and hunting in, albeit out of season. One of the guys they had worked with gave them directions to a spot way back in the swamps and marshes, or the bayou, as it's more commonly called, that they could do that without risking being caught by fish and game agents. He said one of the best things about this spot was there were, oddly enough, never any alligators there. Bit of a red flag, that one. Anyways, one fine morning they set out in their boat before the sun was up, navigating their way through the swamps. From what he described, this was a section that was close to the Mississippi border, routes used by smugglers to move various products across state lines. They finally arrived at the spot after a few hours and some detours, their way of not saying they got lost. Turned off the motor on their boat and started fishing. The trees were just thick enough to prevent you from being seen from overhead, and they were essentially in a huge inlet that was somewhat sheltered from the rest of the bayou and had the start of solid land along two sides of it. By solid land, that also meant you had to walk across 10 to 15 feet of muck that could suck your boots off before you got to solid ground. So according to Zed, the day was progressing, and fishing wasn't going great. But they still had beer, so they weren't inclined to go anywhere. They both noted that, as the guy had said, there were no alligators. Normally, you could spot them lurking around or sunning themselves, but they were just utterly gone from the spot, as were most of the big fish, it seemed. It was at this point they observed a herd of feral hogs emerge from the undergrowth on one side of the lagoon and make their way to the muck that was described before and commence to start rolling and rooting in it to their heart's content. Zed and his buddy slowly angled their boat closer, as they had sidearms with them, and certainly had no issues with getting wild pork instead of fish if the opportunity was there. The hogs were leery but not afraid, keeping the humans in their line of sight as they frolicked. Zed saw they had no real way to get to a hog if they shot it there, so they just floated along and watched for a good opportunity. But instead, they saw something else entirely. According to Zed, that's when they saw the mud start to move. He knew instantly it wasn't an alligator, as an alligator would be flailing around in the mud trying to reach the hogs, and whatever this thing was, it was covered in mud. The only way he could describe it was something was pushing its way through the muck like a mostly submerged bulldozer, creeping up on the pigs. They watched as it slowly approached a cluster of hogs who had noticed the movement, but seemed more curious about what it was than afraid. One of them, a pig that Zed estimated was between 150 to 175 pounds, was the furthest out in the muck and made the mistake of attempting to sniff at whatever the intruder was. Zed said that quicker than they could react, something lunged out from the thing and attached to the pig's head and face. As the pig thrashed and tried to jump back, letting out the most blood-curdling scream they'd ever heard, the thing was hauled partially out of the muck and came into better view. Zed realized it was an alligator-snapping turtle of proportions he had never heard of. He's seen the one they keep at Bass Pro Shop. That got big enough that it cracked its tank and had to get a new one, and he said that was like comparing a chihuahua to a pit bull. It was still partially obscured by the muck that was covering it, but Zed swore its shell had to be at least the size of the hood from a Volkswagen Beetle. He was an extreme car enthusiast, so he knew his vehicles. His best guess on its weight was it was well over 500 pounds, and was now backing up into deeper water, dragging the pig with it. Zed said from what they could see, the turtle's head was so big that it was able to fit, its jaws partially around the pig's skull, and its beak was now essentially acting as a meat hook. Apparently, it was about a 30-second fight to drag the pig out into the lagoon, but Zed said it was clear the pig never had a chance. The turtle dragged it out into the water, and the pig made one last desperate attempt to break free. Apparently hearing something screaming underwater one last time. It's as unnerving as you'd imagine, and Hollywood doesn't get the sound right. It then just went absolutely quiet after that. According to Zed, he and his buddy sat there for a minute, processing what they had just seen, and except for the froth on top of the water and the stirred up mud, there was no sign anything had just happened. The other hogs had fled as soon as their comrade was attacked, and except for some bugs, it was almost completely silent. They couldn't say why, but Zed said they booked it out of there, that something was off, and it felt wrong to be there. It wasn't like they could go to Fish and Game and describe what they saw, but they did fill in their acquaintance on why there were no alligators in that area. As far as Zed knew, nobody else has ever seen this colossal turtle and came forward to talk about it. But Zed said that it was big enough that if it caught a person unawares, it could easily overpower and kill a human, the same way it did that pig. Again, this is how the story was told to me. It's not my story, and I'm inclined to mostly believe it's a tall tale, or an exaggerated one. But it does highlight that you don't need something as fanciful as a skunk ape or Bigfoot to be nervous about what might be lurking out of sight. I live in the Midwest. I live on a small rural lot between a cornfield and a small forest, in a camper. I've lived in this country my entire life. I know the entire county like the back of my hand. This being said, I've come to the conclusion that my experiences around the rural and wooded parts of this country are crawlers. I'm 100% sure of it. I've had many encounters actually. None back to back, but they happen frequently. There is a forest/park in the middle of the town that I always hated at night since I was little. As I got older, my cousin and I thought being scared was really fun. We'd go there at night on purpose, but never lasted long. I always felt like I was being watched. This, on top of urban legends of people going missing here at night, made me feel really uneasy. Fast forward to a couple of years ago. I got married and am settling into the life as a husband. I'd take my large, all-black German Shepherd, Fenrir, on walks with me at night. I always walk towards the park, but I usually don't enter into it. The first time something weird happened was 5 years ago. I was walking Fenrir, and the woods to the front and to the right of me, to the left and behind me was a neighborhood edge and a small playground, went silent. My dog started acting super anxious. He's usually a very stoic dog and quiet. He's 120 pounds and built like a tank. Looks very intimidating and he knows it. I heard rustling in the woods following me, and I felt like I was being stopped. I ran home, and that's the end of the first encounter. I had a few more encounters like that, but last year, things really amped up. I was on a walk around 11:30 p.m. with Fenrir, my wife, and our little newer dog, Booger. He's a terrier Chai mix. We are walking down the same path, and about 3 blocks away from the woods, 4 or so deer are sprinting out of the trees into the street towards us, and they seem terrified. Then I hear what I can only describe as what sounded like a human trying to mimic the sounds of a monkey. I thought it was silly until recently, when I read that other guy's story who heard the same thing. We laughed it off as some kids playing around. Once we get up to the woods and are walking parallel, we can clearly see 2 reflective eyes and a silhouette staring at us from the tree line. We also heard a deep growl, and then like a hissing sound, but it wasn't super high-pitched or anything. Both of our dogs acknowledged this as well. Finn stared, and Booger growled a bit. I made a Facebook post on the community's Facebook group, and other people told similar stories around town. Around this time, I got a job as a tour guide/maintenance for rail explorers. I'm working there again this year as well. We start April 1st. Basically, they take unused or tour-specific railroad sections that aren't used federally and they have these pedal carts with motor assist on them so you can use to explore the tracks. It's super cool and super fun. The one I work at is like 5 minutes from where I live, and it goes through the woods in an inaccessible part of the country, unless you float down the river and hike up steep, loose dirt hills. You go under one old car bridge, and you go over two multi-hundred-foot-length old train bridges. The first one is larger and taller, and it's about 150 feet off the ground above the forest. The second goes over the river. About 6 months into the job and it's fall. We work until midnight, sometimes with the last tour leaving around 9 p.m. That means the last tour for the last 2 months of the year are in complete darkness. The way that job operates is with 6 employees. 4 get on the lead bike, and 2 get on the rear bike. From the lead bike, we drop off one person at the busy intersection so they can flag traffic, and one person gets dropped off at the large train bridge that goes over the woods. The person at the bridge gives a short safety speech to the customers, who stop and go one at a time over the bridge. The employee carts are much faster than the customer ones. We all have walkie-talkies, and we usually have these battery-powered floodlights on stands that we use so the customers can see us, and light up safety vests. On one particular night, we were behind by 20 or so minutes. Instead of leaving the depot at sunset, we were leaving at dusk. I was stationed by the high bridge. By the time we reached the bridge, it was pitch black aside from the stars providing a little light. My coworkers dropped me off and waited with me until the first customer arrived. I gave the little speech to the first cart of 4. I chatted with them a little bit, and I was trying to buy some time and wait for the next customer cart, so there wasn't a massive gap for my coworkers who have to flip the bikes around. After a few minutes, I let those customers leave and I was alone. I was alone for 20 minutes. I used the radio so many times, but it was static for everybody. One of the only times we've ever had an issue like that as well. I kept seeing movement in the tree line. I kept hearing fast footsteps all around me in every direction. I had the floodlight on above my head, so everyone and everything could see me, but I couldn't see anything. I turned off the floodlight and used my personal flashlight. I kept seeing quick glimpses of pale skin moving quickly, but right when I started seeing stuff, I could hear the next customer cart coming close. So I turned the light back on and waited for them to come around the corner. When they pulled up, I noticed they had a little boy with him, and he's scared of the dark. I'm terrified at this point, but have to act appropriately, even more so because of this boy. I don't want to scare him. As I'm finishing my speech, I hear movement right behind me, and I say, "Geez," and spin around with my flashlight on instinct. Poor kid. I told them that it was probably just a deer, and they're good to go across the bridge. That same night, the person stationed at the intersection. This isn't like an in-town intersection. It's very rural. It's right next to a massive cornfield. He's Native American and was very in tune with his culture. He told me privately a few weeks later that he heard rustling in the cornfield, and whatever was out there was whispering his name and trying to get him into the field. He was also without communication for those 20 minutes, but he wasn't in the woods and could see a lot better than me. Another time, me and that same coworker were headed back to the front car. We were way ahead, so we stopped the cart in the middle of the high bridge. It sounds scary. I'm a bit afraid of heights, and this bridge has massive gaps between the planks that you could fit through. But after doing it so often, you get used to it. It was a clear night, and we were watching the stars and having small talk. Then it goes silent. We are 100 or so feet in the air above the woods, and can hear for miles. The dogs barking across the river 2 miles away can be heard without even seeing the houses. We hear what sounds like a human mimicking a monkey noise, and we hear growling. He looks at me completely seriously and tells me in a stern tone that we need to get out of there right now. I drive out of there, and he moved states to Nevada shortly after this. A few other things happened here and there and to coworkers as well. Each of my coworkers have at least one story. I'm only sharing mine in the post. Otherwise, it'd be too long. A few months go by and it's late fall, around the middle of November. I drive through that park in town a lot when I just want to go for a drive. I had my dog Fenrir with me and it's about 2 a.m. I can't sleep, so I'm listening to a Melvins CD and driving leisurely through the park. As soon as I get past the entrance gates, I feel really uneasy and weird. I'm not easily scared. Going to that park at night makes me feel a primal fear. It's beyond fight or flight. I have never felt that way in my life anywhere else, ever. And I feel it every time I'm there. I'm driving through the park and I've rolled the windows up a lot more. Fenrir can still poke his head out but can't leap out. As I go deeper into the woods, I feel worse and worse. I decided not to turn around because I'm already past the halfway point. Turning around would make me stay in the woods longer. I started speeding where there weren't any turns I couldn't see around. I round the last corner, and what I saw made me have nightmares for months. There was a pale, skinny humanoid. Tall and lanky, not quite human, crawling on its hands and feet, but it was crawling very quickly, like 20 miles per hour. We don't have bears here. The only animals that size are large humans and deer. That wasn't a deer. It went from my right, across the street, and went into the tree line. Fenrir saw it too. He doesn't bark at animals, not even other dogs. He went ballistic. He was trying to force himself out of the small gap in the window, nearly foaming at the mouth and snarling. He never, ever acts like that. I'm a certified dog trainer, and I've raced him from birth. Most recently, I've become obsessed with this park. I've walked there at night from my camper to the park with Fenrir. I'll never do it again. I didn't see a figure this time. As I was entering the park, a massive owl flew by my head, so close I could have smacked it mid-flight. This made me feel weird for some reason. As soon as I get into the park, I feel extremely weird, anxious, and nauseous. I walk a few hundred yards to the only streetlight in the entire park, and I turn around and face the woods. Me and Fenrir stand there, frozen for like 10 minutes. The silence was deafening. Anytime I heard anything, I'd jump. Finn was anxious too. He kept staring into a certain spot in the woods a ways off. I swear I saw eyes in there every once in a while. I built up the courage to walk out and haven't gone back since. It'll be interesting to see what happens at my job this year. I wanted to add that the county that I live in is packed full of abandoned mines. Hundreds of them. This happened Easter of last year. My husband's family owns an old farm with a large property with mountains, a lake, and woods. No one lives on the farm anymore, so we use it as a holiday residence. This is west in Norway, so fjords and mountains and lots of red deer all over the place. No neighbors and no animals except for wild ones. There are old ruins from the Viking Age about 500 meters from the house, nearby the lake. Much unknown history, and I find the forest very eerie. I'm Norwegian, and my ex, the father of my kids, are Canadian. He's not so much around anymore, and my daughter, who's 10 years old, is very fond of horror movies. My son, who's 9 years old, also likes a good scare. To help them not forget their Canadian culture, I told them about the Wendigo. This was in the car on our way to the west for the Easter holiday, since there's so much deer out there. I told them a story I've read, and on this sub I do believe, about Wendigo mimicking kitten sounds, and I told them that these Norwegian mountains are the same as the Appalachians before the continents split up, and that's maybe why they can be so eerie. The second day there, we cut down some small trees outside the house. The kids and I dragged the branches over a small field and tossed them down a hill. This hill is where the forest begins, and also the path down to the lake. My husband was in the garage, the other direction, fixing the chainsaw. As we took a break by the tree line, my son, with the Wendigo story in mind, starts to make a special cartoonish cat meow that he thinks is funny into the forest. He kept going maybe 6 to 9 times before I told him to knock it off and get back to help us with the branches. We turn around, and there was a very clear meow coming from the bottom of the hill. It sounded exactly like my son's meowing. It wasn't my son. He stood right beside me, and it was his voice and his characteristic meow. We shrugged it off as someone hiking answering the meowing, and I didn't want to scare the kids for real, and didn't remind them that it's private land, and nobody except for us goes down there, because the only walkable path is through the garden and small field. We got up to the garage, told my husband, and went inside for lunch. He was just like, well, lots of spirits in these woods. And then we didn't talk about it again. He's a man of few words and not easily scared. He grew up on the farm every vacation. He knows the land well and thinks it's mystical, but not scary. My husband reminded me of the meowing in the car on our way there this Easter. We still can't figure out a rational explanation, so we just landed on the spirits in the forest, or a very stupid fox. I've been getting more acclimated to camping as a solo female. I'm pretty comfortable in the woods for the most part. I feel safe and at home. This was my first time solo camping in the area I'm from, so it felt particularly special. Pretty rugged, remote part of WNC. I camped off a gravel road right by the creek. After having dinner by the fire, I settled in my tent, the air of early spring growing colder. As I'm trying to get cozy and drift off, I hear what I can only describe as a woman singing. I'm a skeptic and know our ears can play tricks on us. I've definitely heard things before when there's a monotonous sound like the river, so I tried to brush it off. But it had range. It wasn't consistent at all, as if there was a tune to it. At this point, I froze, holding my breath. The singing sound would stop and then start again. I was terrified, honestly. Eventually, I had to suck it up and go to the restroom. The moon was full so I could see. Nothing there at all. Just the beautiful creek in the night. I continued to hear it for a little while longer before a very poor sleep. That's all. Nothing crazy. But I just know what I heard, and I don't have an explanation. Spirit in the river, perhaps? I don't know. But whatever it was very spooky. I am from Madrid, Spain. My family is from a small mountain city. We are all familiar with mountains. Even though I live in Madrid, I always go to hike in the mountain range surrounding Madrid. I would not consider us to be very superstitious and or believe strongly in supernatural events, although I am a huge fan of folklore. This story happened in the summer. Back when I was 14 years old, my mother took me and my brother for a week-long trip to a mountain range in the southeast of Spain, close to the old town of Rio Par Viejo. We had already spent half of the week going on multiple hikes, and we visited beautiful lakes where me and my brother would swim, despite them being super cold. Overall, we had already had a lot of fun, and we were enjoying our small family trip so far. One day, while it was very sunny and warm, we went on a hike again to this kind of abandoned trail, which some of the locals of the village had recommended. It was not accessible by car, and there was no phone service. We couldn't care less, since we loved to spend time in nature, and we would just spend our time walking and talking instead of being on our phones. We found a crystal clear lake with beautiful turquoise greenish water and lots of water vegetation in it. My brother and I immediately jumped in, and afterwards we had picnic for lunch. So far, so good. Suddenly, while we were enjoying our bocadillo de jamón, we heard a loud scream. It was a very high-pitched scream and just overall scary. Considering the fact that we were next to the lake, in a small valley between tall mountains, we could hear it kind of echo. All three of us immediately looked at each other startled. We were certainly not imagining anything. From what we could deduce, the sound came from the other side of the lake in a very bushy area. The lake itself was not very big, and we decided to make our way around it to investigate. Because although we had not seen anyone during the entire day out there, maybe someone was in danger or needed help. I cannot really specify what the scream sounded like. In hindsight, it was not your typical scream for help. But who knows what humans are capable of sounding like when in dire need of help, right? After about a 20-minute walk, we were already getting to the entrance of the bushy area at the other side of the lake. All three of us approaching with our walking sticks in hand and in a cautious position. The first thing we noticed was an awful smell of rotting flesh. That, together with the scream earlier, made us feel a sense of dread. Normally, you would feel welcome when helping someone out, but we did not feel welcome at all in this place. My instincts were telling me we should just track our way back out of there, while not losing sight of the bushy area. However, we could not shake the feeling that we had to help if someone needed it, so we decided to proceed slowly. The joy and laughter we had at the other side of the lake were no more. Whatever was going on at this side of the lake, it felt wrong and ominous. I cannot talk on my brother or mother's behalf, but the hair on my arms stood on end. After making our way through the brush for 10 minutes, we were finally reaching a clearing. During this whole time, the sense of dread had continued, and the awful smell of rotting flesh had only increased. Finally, in the middle of the clearing, we saw what had caused this smell. In what seemed to be the perfect middle of the small clearing, we found the dead corpse of a deer. Or at least, what remained from it. The limbs were removed from its torso, and the head was half-eaten. The thing is, the cadaver looked fairly fresh, as if it was killed that same day. However, the smell was still that of a rotting and decayed corpse. It did not make any sense. We checked for footprints or dung in the clearing, but did not find anything. A logical explanation would be wolves, or even bears since we got both of them in rural Spain. However, the missing footprints and the way of how this deer was ripped apart made it seem almost unnatural. After we had checked the surroundings, we left as quickly as possible. On our way back, we did not stop to rest at the lake or anything. We just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. When we were leaving the valley behind us, halfway up one of the surrounding mountains, we heard another scream similar to the first one. However, this time we did not feel the urgency to check if someone needed help. Instead, we paced up our speed and did not go back. Somewhere in the evening, when we finally had made it back to our village, we went for dinner at a small old bar in the picturesque town square. We talked to some of the older people from the village about our experience with their abandoned trail. They told us that apparently we had somewhere taken a wrong turn on the trail, since it was not very clear, and that this was the reason that we ended up at the valley with the lake. They also told us that a few centuries back during the Spanish Inquisition, the local townspeople had gone to that valley because a so-called witch lived there and set her house on fire, killing the poor woman. Since then, the locals never hiked close to that lake, or its surroundings in the valley. A couple of days later, we left to go back home, but we have never been able to shake the feeling of dread that we experienced that day. Again, we're not superstitious or big believers of the supernatural, but what happened on that day was definitely weird. These events occurred 2 summers ago in the Grand Teton area. My boyfriend at the time, now husband, let's call him H, was an avid outdoorsman and also served in the military. I was an ecology major and wanted to spend more time outdoors, so he decided to take me on my first backpack, just the 2 of us. For those who aren't familiar, the Grand Tetons are well known for their wildlife, specifically grizzly bears. My only experience with bears up to this point was watching a little black bear cross the road from the safety of my car. Seeing grizzly country signs around every corner wasn't doing much to calm my nerves. The first incident. My boyfriend looked like Indiana Jones, machete hanging from his belt, large knives attached to each side of his pack, bear spray strapped to his waist. You get the picture. The beginning of our 25-mile journey was all uphill. When in bear country, you're supposed to make noise as to not startle the wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on it. As you can imagine, going up a steep hill while carrying a 40-pound pack makes it difficult to make conversation. We were an hour in, and almost at the top of the ascent. I noticed that the woods had gone completely silent, save for the rushing stream that was to our left of the trail. Silent woods are never a good sign. This usually indicates predators nearby. At this point, I was in front of my boyfriend, and we were about to crest the hill. For the past 20 minutes, we had not said a word to each other, having been too tired to speak. We noticed the silence at the same time, and gave each other knowing glances. I came up over the top of the hill and immediately froze. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me in the middle of the trail was a grizzly bear. My husband wasn't aware yet as he was behind me, so I did the first thing that I could think of. While still in my frozen stance, I managed to take my arm and started flinging it wildly behind me, trying to get H's attention. I was too terrified to speak. The bear went from sitting on all fours, not looking away from us once. H quickly swung me around so that I was behind him, and he just started yelling. Being in the military, he knows how to yell. The grizzly quite wasn't fazed, as it started to walk slowly towards us. At this point, I was on the verge of passing out from terror. This bear was about 5 feet in front of us when we heard a loud crack coming from the woods to our right. The bear heard it too, and he bolted towards the stream. A second crack boomed again, this time much closer than before. H said, "It's probably just some falling branches." But we both knew that that wasn't the case. At this point, we were walking quickly up the trail in an attempt to create some distance from the grizzly and those strange noises. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at the same moment, H stopped moving in front of me. He turned around to look at me, and I turned to look behind me. To this day, we were not sure what we saw. Back where we were standing was a large black/brown mass. It looked to be 3 times bigger than the already large grizzly that we had just seen a few moments before. Its back was facing us, and then it stood on its back legs. It looked similar to a bear, but something about the shape was just off. At this point, it was probably stupid to run away, but that is exactly what we did. We were aware of the heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. The footsteps eventually faded. At this point, I was a mess. H was doing his best to console me. "Honey, this is extremely unusual. The bears usually stay away from humans. We're going to be okay. I'm sure that won't happen again." That was enough to convince me to continue on the backpack. Not another hour later, though, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we had sat down, I noticed bushes moving in a line toward the clearing, toward us. Out of the brush comes this adolescent grizzly who looks just as spooked as I'm sure we did, but he came straight for us. H, being the crazy nut that he is, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming, "Bear spray at the ready." That did the trick and the bear ran off. All I could think was just my luck. But that wasn't even close to what happened the second night. The second night, before we began our backpack, we had to let the ranger station know which trails/route we planned to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point during the pack to check on you and make sure that everything is okay. There were not many approved trails left for us to choose from, and it was just our luck that they were the most difficult. Apparently, over the 3 days we were on those trails, we had been the sole hikers. We didn't see a single other person once we were en route. Anywho, I guess we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We had been following hoof prints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen any the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent valuable daylight trying to adjust my boot, laces, and socks to compensate for the pain. When we started on the trail again, we had maybe an hour or two of daylight left, and in the woods it gets dark fast. I was exhausted. It was now dark out, and H was the only one with a working headlamp, as mine wouldn't even turn on for some reason. We needed to find somewhere to set up camp, as we still needed to eat. It was freezing and the wind was blowing. It was creating a howling sound as it rushed through the trees, which made it difficult to hear H, or discern any other sounds coming from the woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we found a clearing. Well, it was more like a bowl. It looked to be roughly 200 meters in diameter, with the sides being roughly 10 meters down from the trail to the bottom of the clearing. This place was strange. We both felt it, though he didn't tell me how freaked out he was until after we had left. There was no moonlight, so all we had was the illumination from his headlamp, our small camp stove, and the flashlight that I fished from my pack. Half of the trees were dead and fallen, just in the bowl. The vegetation everywhere else was pretty dense. To help alleviate my anxiousness, he started playing Ninja Party out of his portable speaker. This didn't help much, as it just echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sounds. He also thought that it would ward off any predators nearby. This is when we knew that our anxiousness wasn't paranoia. The silence was back. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at the clearing. It also may have had to do with the obnoxious music, but because of our previous experience, we decided to turn off the music and head into the tent. Also, it was freezing. As soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we heard deep cracks and thuds echoing from beyond the tree line. Falling trees? There had been a lot of wildfires and very little rain this season. Thud. We both froze. That sound wasn't an echo. It came from inside the clearing. Definitely not a falling tree. Thud. It came from right outside the tent. We both stopped breathing. H's hand found mine and we clung to each other paralyzed. Something dragged across the outside of our tent, making an indent as it went along. It was thin, almost like a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. "I don't know. Shouldn't be a person. We're the only ones on this side of the mountain." I was trying my hardest to stifle sobs, trying to listen to what was outside. I could hear steps, but couldn't decipher what it was. The steps stopped, and then the whole side of the tent was slowly pushed inwards. At this point, whatever was outside knew that we were inside, so I shined my flashlight at the side of the tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was the shape of a human face pressed into the tent wall. I could make out the nose and an open mouth. Each time they breathed, it made the tent around their mouth billow in and out. H said screw that and pulled a Glock from his sleeping bag. He cocked it, and the sound shattered the silence. The face pulled back, and we heard fast footsteps heading towards the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent till the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the smell of urine. We came out of the tent and looked around. Whoever it was had peed on our coals we had left on the fire, leaving a distinguishing stench of evaporated pee. Footprints surrounded our tent, circling around multiple times. Muddy handprints decorated the outside of our tent. We think it was mud anyway. The takeaway? Wildlife is not the most dangerous thing in the backcountry. I could give you 1,000,000 times as a kid and young adult that I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you can actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older, because of forts and carvings that we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and walked for what felt like miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed and play Monopoly. For the sake of backstory on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants that you come across. He had no fear of going and camping out by himself. If I spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far at all when I was alone, because I could never shake the feeling of being watched, which was from paranoia, but still an uneasy feeling. Anyways, camp is set, fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs wood. Sun is down and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on this little chair that he always brought and loading up his makeshift bong, and I was crouched breaking some excess limbs off some logs that we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went just enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness, and neither of us said a word. Across from us on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again, definitely on 2 legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped, with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still, and knew that I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy," and when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him. I had been so fixated on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second the leaves covered the fire, we were in pure darkness. Then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there, and neither of us took our eyes off the spot or moved much for over an hour. Finally, the leaves crunched, and it slowly walked off. Whatever it was had sat crouched watching us without moving for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill, spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at the spot. Nobody went into the tent, and I had very short, light sleep sitting on the ground, with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, we talk about it. In the 7 to 8 years since it happened, my forester friend has not camped by himself out there since. I work as a counselor at a summer camp in Southern California. The place is very out in the woods, so we get all sorts of animals wandering through, from deer and foxes, coyotes howling in the distance, to a mountain lion that's been spotted in the area. The camp also occasionally has a spiritual/haunted vibe. There are a couple of creepy and weird spots. Some things in that area that we think show the place has been inhabited in the past, ghost stories, etc. One night after putting my kids to bed, I was standing outside our cabin, talking to another counselor, when my friend Sadie comes running by with her entire teenage girls' cabin, maybe 12 of them, all dressed in black and freaking out. She screams at me that she thought they heard a ghost, and once her kids were asleep, she'd meet me back here to explain and investigate. Sadie is normally the level-headed type not to freak out easily, so this really caught my attention. She meets me back at my cabin, maybe 30 minutes later, and explains what was going on. She took her campers on a night hike, had them all dress up in black and pretend to be ninjas. All was fun until their way back. They passed a particularly dark part of the trail when they heard off in the distance, just beyond the tree line, what sounded like a faint help from a small child. But each time they heard it, it got more and more distorted until it no longer sounded human, yet still sounded like a child yelling help in the distance. Naturally, they freaked out and ran. Me and Sadie decided to be good counselors and go investigate the sound of a small child yelling help. As we walk over to the area of the trail, we hear it. It doesn't sound like a small child anymore. It sounded more like a demon screeching out its best impersonation of a child. And it didn't sound like it was coming from any point source, but more was coming from an entire mountainside. We booked it back to the safety of the main part of camp, where we tell this story to anyone who will listen. The next day, the camp director had a meeting, where they told us to tell our campers not to freak out at the sound of bobcats in the forest. They are harmless, but do make a high-pitched yelping sound at night. Our friends wouldn't let us live that one down all summer. My uncle built a house on some small acreage that he has that is pretty far out there. There's not another house within 2 miles of his at least, and most of that is woods and cow pastures. But his place is beautiful. He built it all by hand and has a wonderful wraparound deck, perfect for family get-togethers. We were all out there, probably 20 adults and 5 or 6 kids for a party one day. It was one of those summer times when it's blazing hot out, but the light breeze is cool enough that you don't notice it after a while. I had been there hanging out all day when I was asked to run into town and grab some more groceries. So I packed up and headed out. I got the groceries and everything was fine. As I drove back, it was starting to get dark, and it was at a time of the year when dark comes fast. It was pitch black out there when I finally arrived. As I pull up, I notice something is sitting in front of my car, facing the house. It was not disturbed by my headlights, but it does glance back at me once. It's a panther, just chilling there, watching the party. And as I sat there for a second watching it, I notice that it has specifically placed itself near the edge where all the kids are running around. After I have my headlights on it for a minute or so, it kind of looked back at me again as if to say, "Okay, I was caught. Oh well." And then it gave the most human-looking sigh and just walked off into the woods. I sat there for a bit before building myself up to getting out of the car and going to the party and telling everyone. I went to Guatemala with my girlfriend, did a 3-day hike through the jungle to Tikal, slept in a tent at 2 tiny ranger campsites deep in the woods. During the second night, a massive thunderstorm was coming down above us. At 4 a.m., I woke up and heard some male voices, and I left the tent to check it out. 2 guys with rifles approached me, told my girlfriend to stay in the tent because it was scary. She didn't comply and joined me. Turns out, those guys were local hunters looking for shelter in the camp. We offered them coffee. They were more than happy. About 30 seconds later, the storm got so intense that a big tree fell and crashed onto our tent. If I had not left to check out the guys or worse, my girlfriend would have listened. We both would be very dead right now. When I was a kid around 8 or 9, my mom, grandma, brothers, and I went camping at a small camp about 2 hours from the town that we lived in. We went there a lot, and even had a particular campsite that we had slowly built up over the years. On this particular trip, we had my aunt and uncle's dogs with us, since they were doing military tours. They were both very well-trained bird dogs, but usually really calm and friendly. The first night on this particular trip, and one of the dogs, Star, starts growling in the tent at about 1 in the morning. My mom is thinking something is outside and arms herself and investigates with the dogs. As she gets out the tent, Star and Ariel would not let her move to the other edge of the campsite, and both get into attack position while herding my mom towards the car. This is while also keeping themselves in front of the tent. By this point, we're all up, and with a group of kids under 10 freaking out. For a reason she can't even explain today, my mother packs up camp and gets us all into the car to head home. After about 10 minutes out of the campsite, a car starts following us, and the dogs get in the back and just growl. By this point, everyone was in borderline panic mode, and my brothers were crying the entire car ride home. As the town came into view, you have to cross a huge bridge to drive in, and the car was still following us. And as a kid, you make stories to yourself that nothing is wrong, and the car behind you is just full of scared people too. Yet, as we start across the bridge, the car stops and just turns around, speeding back the way we came. We stopped at a gas station, and everyone was near meltdown mode, and my mom goes in to get cigarettes. But Star would not let her back into the car until she could see her clearly. This, and a camping trip a few years ago, later convinced me that camping is no longer my thing.